Hi there. Today we're going to be looking at the symbolic interactionist view of crime and deviance. And as we've been looking at in theory, symbolic interactionism has got several different branches to it. The phenomenological approach, social action approach, and interpretivism, in the sense that symbolic interactionists will generally use interpretivist research methods as well. We've come across some of these sociologists before, whether in Marxism or looking at realism. We've got Howard Becker with the glasses, then we've got Jock Young to his right, Stan Cohen to his right, and we've got Shambliss to his left, Braithwaite with the glasses at the bottom, and on the far right-hand bottom corner, that is Dick Hobbes. All sociologists you can refer to when thinking about symbolic interactionism, as well as some other perspectives as we've looked at. So when we think about the symbolic interactionist approach, it's worth thinking, well, how is it different to the previous perspectives we looked at? Functionalism, the subculturalist approach, which obviously sits within functionalism, right realism, and even to an extent, how is it different to left realism and even Marxism, even though there are some significant similarities. If you can ever think of any differences, please make a note on your version of the PowerPoint or on your notepad. But here's some of the ones that I can remember. They don't trust official statistics at all. They see them as socially constructed in the sense that they are the outcome of a social process and generally reflect social attitudes about who is more likely to be criminal and deviant, who is more likely to be a victim, for example. They're socially constructed. And that links in with labelling, it links in with stop and search, stereotyping, and all those kind of processes. Symbolic interactionists are, one of their criticisms is they ignore big structures like class and poverty, and I guess generally that would be like a Marxist criticism of symbolic interactionism. They're also not very concerned with why people actually commit crime in the first place. They're more concerned with who ends up being labelled as criminal and who has the power in society to attach that label. And finally, they would say that the vast majority of the population have committed a crime. However, what's interesting is we only think of certain groups as being criminal. Your starting point when considering the labelling theory and crime and deviance is that effectively they think deviance is only something which is labelled as deviant. There is nothing deviant about any behaviour. It only becomes deviant when it is seen and labelled as deviant. That might sound a bit abstract. So when we think about how it differs from more traditional explanations of deviance, you've got to take into account that what I've just referred to about earlier on, they're not that concerned with why crime happens. They're more concerned with why we see particular behaviour or people as criminal. Like what social processes go on before that for us to suddenly think, you know what? Youths wearing hoodies are obviously thugs, like that process. They don't become deviant until the label of them being deviant is successfully applied, in the sense that they might accept that they're thugs and therefore act in that particular way. Very different from traditional explanations of deviance. It's a much more complex process that's all to do with the interactions between the different groups in society. Some of you might remember Hurricane Katrina or reading about it as a natural disaster, possibly in some of your other subjects, where a huge hurricane ripped through the area of like New Orleans in America and devastated the entire area, led to like mass flooding, quite a high number of fatalities associated with it as well. These are two stories that were published at that time. And I'm really interested in what social factors do you think have contributed to the different labels being attached to exactly the same action. So as you can see in the pictures, you've got people carrying food and goods in their arms, okay? The one on the left, a white couple, they wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina came through New Orleans, Louisiana. Whereas the black man on the right, it says, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday. Again, it's that notion of who is labelling the black community as a deviant and allowing the white community to actually, according to the label, they're actually just doing it to survival. However, the black community are looting and stealing. And who does it benefit to apply those labels in such a way? So, Howard Becker, who I always think of as like the granddaddy of the labelling theory and what have you, he said that social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction constitutes deviance and by applying those rules to a particular people and labelling them as outsiders. Deviance is a consequence of the application by others of rules and sanctions to an offender. The deviant is one to whom the label has been successfully applied. Deviant behaviour is behaviour that people so label. What did he actually mean by that? And to do that, you really do need to break it down, sentence at a time. So when we think about social groups creating deviance by making rules, well, who are those social groups that are creating deviance by labelling others as deviant? And Howard Becker would probably talk about, the power elite, for example. So it's actually these groups who are the ones who are creating deviance by labelling other people's behaviour as deviant. Okay. What Becker is saying in the second part of the quote is that deviance is the outcome of a successful label. So again, if someone accepts that they're a deviant and they believe everyone thinks they're deviant, they're much more likely to behave in that way, which confirms the label and proves the original social groups right. So here's an example. Imagine that no glasses are allowed. If anyone wears glasses, they are deviant. They are seen as weird. And this is what Becker talked about when it comes to labelling groups. We look for symbols associated with different groups to help us make sense of who those groups are. So imagine the symbol of glasses represents something. Okay, so when people wear glasses, that represents a particular type of person or a group of people or behaviour, which means that we already can react to it in a very negative way. That might seem like a really odd idea. However, when we look at the case of in Cambodia, Pol Pot was the leader of the Khmer Rouge and was responsible for the mass genocide of selected groups within his own country of Cambodia. It was a significantly dictatorial regime, and Pol Pot was extremely paranoid, as well as pretty much starving the majority of his population. He also executed selected groups that he thought were threats, if you like, to his sort of dominance. And one of those groups was what he perceived as intellectuals, so those who had maybe gone to university, for example. And one of the symbols associated with being an intellectual was wearing glasses. So when thinking about Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, can you tell me how this demonstrates Howard Becker's view? So which is the social group that's creating the deviance by making rules? Who is the one who made the rules, if you like? Then think about which group is actually being labelled so that they become the outsiders in that society. If they are then labelled as rebels, and they were all seen as potential rebels or threats to stability, what impact do you think it had on those that wore glasses, those that were seen as part of the intelligentsia or the intellectuals? And how does this show the label has been successfully applied? So think about what that group would start to do if they'd been labelled as outsiders, if they'd been labelled and as dissidents, they were threatened with being arrested or executed. What do you think that group started to do to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia? Do you think they'd have just taken it lying down, or do you think they actually would have started trying to rebel and overthrow? So there are a few different views on why laws are actually made. Marxists believe that all laws reflect the interests of the ruling class. Remember Frank Pierce? Functionalists, a consensus theory, believe that the rules are there for the benefit of the whole of society, whereas labelling theorists argue that they reflect the interests or beliefs of moral entrepreneurs. Now, a moral entrepreneur is someone who takes the lead, or a group of people who take the lead in labelling a particular behaviour in a negative way, and spreading or popularising this label throughout society. And this is Becker's concept. A good example of when moral entrepreneurs really did enact a rule change would be the prohibition laws in 1920s in America, when they outlawed alcohol. That mainly was because of the sort of the quite impassioned campaigning of religious groups and women's groups that saw alcohol as this source of deviance, like gambling, prostitution, crime, and had been blamed partially for, the economic underperformance of the country. So by banning alcohol, they believed they could get rid of all these other social ills. So when thinking about which studies of labelling you want to be able to refer to in your exams, these are the ones you need to look at, okay? I'm going to give you a handout on the system, a PDF, but you can also look some of these up online possibly. There's Howard Becker's study of the outsiders. There's Jock Young's research on the drug takers, looking at hippies. There's William Chambliss, 2 bits of research we're going to be looking at, Saints and Roughnecks, okay, and the RDU, the research he did with the Rapid Deployment Unit. Really, really interesting bit of research. There's also Braithwaite's labelling and shaming, and his idea that we need to be reintegrative with criminals in order to keep crime rates low. Sounds very familiar to left realism, okay? This notion that we can't keep on marginalising deviant groups because it will just reinforce their deviance. And it's also worth having a quick look at the mental health and labelling research that Goffman and Rosenham did, at page 102 in your books. But again, a quick Google, you should be able to find that study as well, just to find out a bit more about how it demonstrates what the impact that labelling can have on social groups and how people who are powerful can actually apply these labels to much weaker groups in society for their own benefit. When we consider labelling, one of the processes that labelling can trigger is deviancy amplification. And we've looked at Stan Cohen briefly before, but we're going to spend a bit more time looking at him today. He did a study called Folk Devils and Moral Panics, and he was really interested in how the way society reacted to deviant behaviour and how that actually, if you like, amplified the problem and then sort of became a problem in itself. Okay, and this is what's known as the deviancy amplification cycle. So there's kind of a very basic diagram below talking you through it. You sort of have a perceived social problem and a deviant act may be associated with that social problem. So, I'll go back to hoodies, young people wearing hoodies, and a group is identified as a cause, okay? So you get young kids wearing hoodies, they hang around in street corners, that's perceived as deviant. They become what's called a folk devil. In the sense that it's almost like a fairy tale. It's not real, but in people's minds, people become scared of these groups. The media then exaggerates this group as being a deviant group and a problem, and this is where we get kind of the moral panic start to kick in. Then we get societal reaction, which is amplified by this media engagement. And on the right-hand side there, I've said the media attention, they bring in experts and they whip up public concern and suggest solutions. And this is all deviancy amplification. All of a sudden, this group that were just hanging out in the street corners, maybe smoking, maybe drinking, becomes seen as real deviants and outcasts, and everyone kind of wants them dealt with and kind of wants them to kind of get off the street corners and be put in jail in some cases, or possibly have ASBOs applied to them. A good example of deviance amplification and this use of so-called experts is the Steve Emerson interview on, I think it was Fox News, when he said that Birmingham was a no-go zone because of Islamic radicalisation, and there was like a Islamic police going around and beating women for dressing inappropriately. Completely no evidence for that at all, but he was brought on as an expert, and all of a sudden people just started panicking, in America mainly, about Islamic extremism. Okay. Because of societal reaction and this moral panic, the media and these experts start calling for punishments to be set to persecute these offenders. And so the police and the courts become very sensitised. They might want to make examples of to discourage the deviants. They then look for more cases of this deviance. So the police might be looking for the youths on the street corners. They might stop and search more often. They might find drugs, alcohol, underage drinking, or what have you on them, and that will prove that this group is a deviant group. We need to kind of to monitor them more. We need to stop and search them more often, and this kind of reinforces the idea that they really are social problems for society, or folk devils, as Stan Cohen would have called them. This is really similar to Lemert's study on Inuits back in 1972. He was really interested in the consequence of rule enforcement. And he said, effectively, you have primary deviance and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is when you break a rule, okay? Or you break a rule, you break a law. And it's not really seen significant unless you're labelled as deviant, which is kind of true. Like, you don't feel like a criminal unless you get caught. So you might steal something, but if you don't get caught stealing it, you're not going to be labelled as a criminal because no one knows you've done it. But what he was interested in was this secondary deviance. And this is a result of the consequence of being labelled. And this can actually make the deviance itself much worse. So he looked at the Inuits. In the Inuit culture, public speaking is seen as something that's a source of pride. It is a really important feature of their community. So the primary deviance would be for a young person to have a slight stutter. Now, that's not a problem in itself, but the secondary deviance would be when the community reacts to that slight stutter in a really negative way, talking about it, talking about how they're wrong, talking about how they're not going to be able to speak. And Lemert said, this actually ends up increasing the anxiety and makes the stutters much worse for these young people. So it becomes deviancy amplification. The problem is much worse for society, it's much worse for the individual, and they find it even more difficult to integrate in society. And you can apply that exactly to the problems criminals face when they try to reintegrate into society after committing a crime. So, moral panics. This is a result of the way the media reacts to deviant behaviour. Like I said before, the deviants are seen as folk devils, and their behaviour is a threat to law and order. The agents of social control respond to the media's pressure. Obviously, the media is an agent of social control, but things more formal agents like the police and the courts, they are called upon to do something. And again, this amplifies the moral panic. And this leads to deviancy amplification, where the deviance is seen as far more serious a problem than it actually is. But the real problem is that the groups that are being labelled deviant, they are constantly being labelled deviant, they're being seen deviant, they're being treated as deviant, and we know that that can trigger a self-fulfilling prophecy, which can make the problems much worse. In a sense, moral panics are an example of an agent of social control, and they try to correct perceived deviant behaviour. But labelling theorists and Stan Cohen were always very interested in which behaviour is seen as deviant and who, again, is labelling that behaviour as deviant. So on the next slide, this is what we've looked at before, which was the mods and rockers clashes in the 1960s, 1964 mainly. You guys might remember the media. It was a very quiet news weekend or period, and there wasn't much to report on. These two different groups, the mods and the rockers, would go down to the seaside towns, and there were a couple of very low-key clashes, but the way the media reported them, it made it seem like this was a huge social problem, that these groups were intentionally going down there to be violent against each other. So by the time the next bank holiday came around, after several weeks of reporting on these, deviant acts at the seasides, more mods and more rockers went down to these areas, kind of almost expecting a bit of a fight, purely because of the way the media reported on it. The media, the journalists are all sent down to the seaside towns looking for signs of violence, trying to, if you like, almost encourage some of the violence between the groups so they could have a news story to report. And the police get involved, people get arrested, the government responds, they introduce hooliganism laws, and many of them were fined and put in jail. So quite strict responses by the police and the courts, all because of the way the media reported on this social group. But it is worth at this point thinking about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the labelling theory. Some of the advantages is that it focuses on the impact labelling can have on behaviour. It's really critical of the media, and it highlights problems in policing, such as racism and prejudice, things that we've been covering a bit before in Marxism and left realism as well. Again, it's this bit that they're the ones who are interested in the role of the powerful in defining behaviour of weaker groups as criminal, and why and who does that benefit, links somewhat to Antonio Gramsci's theory of scapegoating when the crisis of capitalism or hegemony. Does point some weaknesses of functionalism and realism, in that it criticises the idea that some of the behaviours that we see as criminal aren't actually that criminal. So people getting arrested for loitering, like zero tolerance would do, let's face it, that's not actually a criminal act. It's loitering, it's standing still, it's hanging out on a street corner or on a park bench. Disadvantages of labelling is that people who commit crime don't always do because they've been labelled. Forgets about crimes of passion. It doesn't explain white collar crime, where people aren't being labelled as criminal but they still act criminally. There's the idea that it's overly deterministic. Becker's been criticised for that before. Just because someone's been labelled as deviant doesn't mean that they act that way. ignores the victim, and again, it kind of almost says the criminal themselves are the victims. And actually, quite difficult to solve the problem of labelling. We need a sort of realistic solution, but you can't stop the media reporting the way it does about certain groups. Maybe we can encourage them to report more ethically, but that's not really something that's on the cards at the moment. So the final study I want to talk to you about is Dick Hobbs's research on a more recent moral panic known as binge drinking. So firstly, what is binge drinking? Something I'm sure not many of you are familiar with, but it's defined as drinking alcohol in order to get drunk. It's quite a broad definition there. Dick Hobbs said, actually, the problem is media generally reports very positive images of alcohol. We have adverts, very funny adverts actually, from the alcohol industry. And he also said that the drinking alcohol is an essential part of the nighttime economy, the economy that effectively operates in the dark in this country. So pubs, clubs, kebab shops, taxis. Alcohol is a really big part of that. If you took the alcohol out, would we still have a nighttime economy? However, when it comes to all the problems associated with excessive alcohol, people don't generally want to blame alcohol itself. Instead, they see teenagers who drink as problems. And the teenagers who drink become the face of alcohol abuse. They are the folk devils. They're the ones that we're all worried about, and they're the ones causing all the problems, not the alcohol. They are criticised for drinking too much and their unruly behaviour by moral entrepreneurs. We've had documentaries made by it. We have journalists visiting town centres late at night to record kind of drunken, debauched behaviour. This leads to calls in the media for a clampdown on excessive drinking. Experts, like health experts, come in and talk about health impact, the impact on the environment. If you want to have a quick Google of something called drunk tanks, that'll give you one of the responses to like drunken disorderly behaviour in town centres at night. And this essentially leads to a moral panic about young people drinking. Okay, not alcohol, it's the young people who drink. And you've got to remember why young people are easy to label negatively and start a moral panic about. This is because they are a group that's relatively marginalised. Not many people listen to them because young people, if you're under 18, you can't even vote, don't forget. So here's an example of a few headlines associated with sensationalising this issue of youth drinking culture. And I won't read through them, but have a quick read of them yourself. Look at how they use sort of symbolic shorthands here, which is something that Stan Cohen talked about, like calling yobs symbolic shorthand, talking about hoodies in the orange box. Obviously, hoodies is an item of clothing; it's not a person. And they try really to build up this idea that teenagers are the issue. We need to sort teenagers out again, not the alcohol. The last one I find quite interesting: the rise of urban savages. That's really trying to paint a particular picture of this kind of group that we need to be concerned about. And we've got to think about the impact that really has on that group. If you're constantly being told these things about you, how can this lead to deviance amplification? Dick Hobbs argued that, you know what, if it wasn't alcohol, if it was other drugs, we would be asking things like, who were the where is everyone getting this drug alcohol from? What social problems does this cause? How can we catch users and how can we punish users? So say we were talking about cocaine or cannabis and all these people were doing these drugs and causing this much social havoc. We'd be trying to get rid of the drug. We say, hang on, we need to get people off this drug because it's causing such chaos on our streets and so many difficulties for our health. But we don't really ask those questions about the drug out of alcohol. And what Dick Hobbs is interested in is why. And in particularly, he's interested in the government's response to this moral panic. So why do you think alcohol has not been challenged as a drug that is, if you like, deviant? Why has alcohol not had that status attached to it? Why do we blame instead the young people that drink it rather than the actual drug that caused all these problems in the first place? Well, Dick Hobbs was interested in how the government responded to it, and he said, in response to this moral panic, they then introduced new licensing laws which allowed pubs to stay open longer. That might seem completely bonkers when at the same time as health experts are telling us that alcohol is causing all these problems for certain groups of people, the government then decides to extend licensing hours so that people can drink more for longer. Again, Why? Why do you think? What's the motive behind this? And I really almost need to start thinking a bit of a Marxist way here. What's the motive behind allowing pubs to stay open longer? Again, Dick Hobbs said it's all to do with the nighttime economy. Investment in the nighttime economy is about £1 billion a year or more. It employs 1 million people, and the number of licensed premises have increased by 30% in the past 25 years. It's a growing sector. And sorry, the formatting here has gone a bit funny. Essentially, Dick Hobbs argues the government needs the nighttime economy, but they also need a scapegoat to blame all the social problems it's causing. So they blame drunk youths. And they actually want to blame the youths to distract from the real problems that alcohol actually causes our society, because it's not something they want to get rid of, because the government makes a fortune in the nighttime economy, let alone the tax they charge on alcohol. So I'm going to have a look at the following graphic with you. Which group do you think really have a problem with alcohol when you look at it? So yeah, if you look at the graph on the left, the dark red bars, that's where most people die from alcohol poisoning, those ages, so 35 to 64, and actually 45 to 54 is the highest group, not the 15 to 24 group that constantly is demonised by the media in the moral panics. And again, most people who die of alcohol poisoning are men, just under a quarter are women, and yet quite a lot of headlines demonise female drinking as well. So despite all this medical research, and these are statistical facts, there has been a social policy that's been bumping around Parliament for a while, but it hasn't been introduced, and that is to introduce pricing per alcohol unit, which would make things like, really strong ciders, for example, and, vodka really quite expensive. And it was all about trying to discourage young people, people who can't really afford to drink. Discourage them from drinking. And yet, teenagers are still being blamed for this problem, despite the fact that middle-class people who can probably afford that alcohol won't be affected by this policy. Sternheimer argued that it goes back to that who has the power to label groups as deviant. And it said it's not a new thing to blame teenagers. It's all to do with which groups are identified as problematic populations at particular times. In the early 1800s and 1900s, there were laws that made it illegal for African Americans and Native Americans to drink alcohol. They were seen as like the deviant group, and the immigrants were also targeted. Again, blame that group, not the alcohol. Young people weren't really targeted until the student rebellions of the 60s and 70s, which we've looked at before, where there was quite a lot of anti-establishment activism. Young people... all of the anti-establishment activism was blamed on alcohol and drug use, and it completely deflected from their messages like, anti-war, pro-civil rights, pro-feminism, anti-government. It was a way, if you like, of the government and the media deflecting attention from their core message. So again, it's all about power, very similar to Chambliss. And Sternheimer writes, white middle-class men over 30 typically have more social power than the groups commonly targeted as problems. They also vote, and no sane politician is going to campaign warning of the dangers of alcohol, because you'll alienate yourself from a lot of your voters. Not to mention, she says, how the alcohol industry would feel about the government telling their richest customers to curb their drinking. They prefer much more to focus on young people and women, the slightly weaker groups in society. And again, it all boils down to who benefits from this moral panic the most. And really, if we're being really sceptical, it's the big companies at the expense of all social groups' health, because middle-class people are dying from alcohol misuse. Finally then, we've got to think about, are moral panics actually an outdated idea? And McRobbie and Thornton would say yes, they are. And this would be some of the reasons why. Frequency. There are so many moral panics these days that they're not noteworthy. We don't pay attention to them. Can you have a quick look at the Daily Mail website now? See if you can see any examples of moral panics where they're trying to make us worry about a particular group of people. And do you think they have been successful? It is worth, you can criticise McRobbie and Thornton and say, actually, there are some stories there where they've been very successful, particularly like demonising immigrants, for example. Has the media been successful? And look at the Brexit vote. Was the media particularly successful in turning us all against refugees and immigrants as like folk devils that we needed to be worried about? But perhaps not. We're not as susceptible to moral panics as we used to be, because there are so many different types of moral panics. But Robin Thornton also said it's too difficult to create a moral panic about a particular group, as we are too diverse now to label a single group as bad. And there's reflexivity. We are so well aware that politicians and journalists try to create moral panics that we don't really take them very seriously when they try to. We are aware that they're attempting to manipulate us, and we just don't take it very seriously. So can you think of a recent moral panic? One that I remember from a couple of years ago, it was the moral panic about foxes. I don't know if you recall this, when the media was crying out for foxes to be exterminated in particular urban areas because they were going into houses and attacking babies, when I think the most they did was probably scratch or bite a baby. And then the actual moral panic itself failed because people refused to kind of accept the kind of sort of over-exaggerated evidence of experts that foxes were these sort of feral animals that need to be wiped out. But can you think of a recent example of a moral panic, and can you think of one that's maybe been stopped in its tracks? So have a look at the Daily Mail website for some ideas. But yeah, we'll talk about this in class in a bit more detail. Thank you.